In today's notes, we are going to be talking about tool marks. So a tool mark is any impression, abrasion, or cut made when contact occurs between a tool and an object. Tool marks are a good example of physical evidence formed at a crime scene. Obviously, tool marks are not biological evidence. They are not coming from the human body. Now, most tools in this day and age are mass-produced. So, however, even in those mass productions, there are typically minor differences that can differentiate one tool from another. So, like we saw in our impression evidence and our shoe evidence, tool marks fall in that gray area of class and individual. Where tool marks do have individual characteristics, the question is, are they enough? Impressions made by these tools could link the tool to a crime scene and hopefully ultimately the owner. So the thing about tools is they increase our ability to handle manual tasks, perfectly legal tasks. So pretty much everyone owns tools. We own shovels and rakes and hammers and screwdrivers and all of those different things that we use for perfectly innocent, normal purposes. The issue is that these tools that help people can also be used in crimes. That same shovel that is used to plant a rose bush can be used to bury a body. So how can a tool used in a crime lead investigators to a criminal? So likely what we are going to do is we are going to look at the tool mark, which we're going to talk about more. We are then going to identify the type of tool it came from, start investigating suspects that we have to see whether they own that type of tool, and then see if we can find a match between the tool mark and that tool that one of our suspects owns. But here's where it gets a little bit tricky. Ownership of a tool used in a crime is circumstantial evidence. Just because someone is the owner of the hammer that was used in a crime, for example, does not necessarily mean that that person committed that crime. There is no guarantee that just because they own the hammer, that they were the only person who uses that hammer. They could have let their neighbor borrow it. They could have let a friend borrow it. So ownership, making the connection between ownership and the person who committed the crime can be difficult. So a lot of times we are going to need other supporting evidence to connect that person to our crime. As I mentioned before, there are three types of tool marks. The first is indentation marks. So tools usually leave distinctive marks where they are used. The hardness of a tool influences the resulting marks left in the softer object. So the bigger difference you have between how hard the tool is and how soft the surface is, the deeper the indentation mark is that you're going to get. So indentation marks are made when a tool is pressed against a softer surface. So think about like putting a crowbar underneath a window and pressing down to try and open up that window. You have your crowbar, the tool, which is pretty hard. You have a wooden windowsill. Wood is softer than metal, so it's going to leave an indentation of the crowbar in the windowsill. The impression made indicates information such as the size of the tool used at the crime and may even allow us to figure out the general type of tool used. Here's a picture showing an indentation mark left by this hammer. You can see this hammer smacked into this softer surface, and we can see that that cross-hatched base of the hammer, that pattern was left in the surface. So now we know we're not only looking for a hammer, we're looking at a hammer with a cross-hatched pattern, which is going to be more unique. The second type of tool mark is abrasion marks, and an object surface can be ground or worn away by a tool. It is the harder object that will cause the abrasions on the softer surface. So our tool is leaving these abrasion marks on our softer surface, and these are made when surfaces slide across each other. A great example of abrasion marks that is typically not criminal is when you sand something. So when you want to make something smoother, you get sandpaper to rub it down. You're actually leaving abrasion marks in the wood when you use sandpaper. Now, indentation and abrasion marks can sometimes be made at the same time. Going back to our crowbar example before, if while trying to pry open the window with the crowbar slips across that wooden surface, you may get an abrasion from the slip, but an indentation from the pressing down. Now, the most common type of abrasion mark that we see is going to be talked about more in our upcoming part of this unit of ballistics, because ballistics leave abrasion marks, guns leave abrasion marks on bullets. So that is what you are looking at here. You can see this line going down the center. This is a test-fired bullet, and this is a crime scene bullet, and you can see they have identical abrasion marks on them. The last type of tool impression we have are cut marks. So if they are hard enough, edged instruments can penetrate a softer object and separate it into two marks. Cut marks are produced along the edge of a surface. They cannot be matched exactly, and that is because cut marks are essentially self-erasing. The most common type of cut mark you get is from a knife or a saw. And if you think about the sawing motion, as you're going back and forth, you are altering the cut mark that you left from the previous back and forth. So it does make them very difficult to match exactly. However, we can get an idea of what type of cutting instrument we are looking for based on the pattern left behind. So let's talk about that more. So hacksaws, for example, leave chopping marks on the surface of contact. And we can see that this is on bone, and we can see we have these cut marks that were left in the bone. Now, we would likely call these hesitation marks because they are not very deep and definitely did not penetrate the whole bone. So this would indicate to us something additional, that the person making these has probably never cut into bone before. Continuing on about cut marks, as we said before, you can tell based on what the cut mark looked like what potentially left the cut mark, and you are responsible for knowing these. So a striker saw, for example, leaves circular areas with a short radius and some overlapping marks. It's going to leave very few teeth marks because it is a very high-powered saw. Meanwhile, a bandsaw, also a powered saw, is going to leave a very smooth cut, and again, very few teeth marks and very few overlapping marks. Meanwhile, a hacksaw is not a powered saw, it is man-powered, so it's going to leave a lot of overlapping marks and actually creates a tiny tic-tac-toe board that looks like 1,000 little squares. Now, a chainsaw is also going to be a powered saw, but because instead of cutting with a saw blade, it is cutting with a chain, hence the name chainsaw, it is going to leave a very messy cut because it is just essentially the chain moving at a high enough power that it can cut through something. So it leaves a very messy cut with a very roughened edge. And then we have a table saw, another type of power saw. It's going to leave parallel curved striations. It does leave ridged grooves behind. So these are just some saws. There's plenty more out there. So we can tell what type of saw was likely used based on the pattern that we see. So when a crime scene contains a tool mark evidence, a lot of times our forensic investigators are trained in tool mark examination, but if they are not, there are such a thing as tool mark experts that can be called in if one is not currently on staff. Evidence can include tool marks at the scene, as well as even tools that are left at the scene. I know this is often surprising to students because you'd think a criminal would take everything with them, but a lot of times crimes are crimes of opportunity, and they end up using tools that were already at the scene, so they don't think to take them with them because they didn't come with them. Now, when it comes to documenting our evidence, if possible, we want to actually collect the tool mark evidence. We want to take it with us. However, this is not always going to be possible depending on the surface that our tool mark was left in. So if it is not going to be possible for us to actually take the tool mark with us, we can preserve it with an impressions of we can take castings in order to take that impression of the tool mark with us. The cast impression will retain the unique indentation marks made by a specific tool. There are a variety of silicone and rubber-based casting materials that can be used to record impression marks. Now, unlike in our impression unit where we talked about using plaster of Paris is not going to be near detailed enough in order to make these impressions, so we need something like rubber or silicone that can really get the details in there. So let's watch a video on taking a cast.
For this this video, we're going to be using microcell to cast a tool mark impression. Now, ideally, if it was possible, you would bring the object that had the tool mark impression back to the lab with you. But if for some reason you cannot remove that object, you can go ahead and use microcell to cast the tool mark itself and then bring that cast with you back to the lab for analysis. So here we have a doorknob, and there is a tool mark impression on it. So we're going to go ahead and mix up some microcell
and cast that. Use the back of
a fingerprint card to mix this up on. And we're going to draw 2 even lines of material.
One with the microcell. And one with the hardener.
Mix that
until everything turns white with this tongue depressor.
Want to make sure that you mix it completely.
That all of the blue disappears into the mixture. Now that's fully mixed. I'm going to take this material
and spread it over this tool mark impression.
Now this is going to take about 15 minutes to dry and harden all the way. So we're just going to let that set.
And I'll show you how to lift it when it's done. Now that the microcell is hardened, we can go ahead and peel this off, just starting from one side. Lift and peel. And you have an accurate impression of the tool mark.
So you can see the level of detail these microcell, which is a silicone-based product, products are able to get. We can see that not only was it a dent on the doorknob like it may have originally looked like, whatever we are looking for that made that dent had multiple prongs up at the top and kind of scraped down. So these casts are very important and can get us a lot of detail. Surfaces should be examined before casting material is applied to determine if that area should be dusted for fingerprints. Like in the video we just watched, that doorknob is likely what the perpetrator of that crime used to open the door. If they weren't wearing gloves, they may have left fingerprints on it. And no offense to tool marks, but fingerprints are likely going to be more valuable data to us. Additionally, the process of dusting for fingerprints is unlikely to disturb our tool mark. However, the process of putting the casting material on the doorknob would destroy a fingerprint. So we do want to dust for prints first if we have any suspicion that there might be a fingerprint near our tool mark. The use of magnetic dusting powder and silicone material allow for fingerprints to be lifted from the surface before impression marks are cast. The size of the impression should be measured and recorded. So we do also take measurements of tool marks. Because two things may look similar, but if their measurements are different, they are not going to be from the same tool. Now, when it comes to collecting and preserving a sample, we do need to correctly label our evidence. Oftentimes, the people who collect the tool mark evidence are not going to be the same people as analyzing it, so we need a good label. You're going to wrap small objects with clean paper and place them in small containers or plastic bags because we don't want any other marks to get left on them through the process of transportation and storage. So we want to make sure whatever tool mark on there is safe, but also that we aren't adding any additional marks to that object on accident. If it is a larger object, once again, we're going to package it in a carton or a box, making sure that we do not damage it and that it does not get damaged. You're going to record who collected the evidence, where it was found, when it was found, and why the evidence was collected. Chances are in most people's homes there are a variety of tool marks for different reasons all over the place, so you wouldn't want to collect every single tool mark at a scene, so you do want to say, like, we collected the front door, family said that that dent was originally not there. And I know we haven't talked about it in a while, but let's not forget about maintaining our chain of custody in order to make sure that we can present that evidence in court. Now, once our either object or our cast makes it back to the lab, we are going to do our tool mark analysis. And we are looking to identify the major characteristics, defining the tool and the type of tool used in the crime scene, any unique characteristics that might distinguish it between the same types of tools. So for example, back in the indentation mark, remember there was that hammer that had that crosshatch pattern on it. Not all hammers have that, so that is a unique characteristic. And we're not going to force the tool to match the tool mark. This can be very tempting to say, yes, these are a match when they are not. So we always want to be mindful of not creating a match where there isn't one. Forensic comparison microscopes are used to further examine tool mark characteristics that match a suspect. Comparison microscopes allow someone to, out of one eye, be looking at one thing, and out of a second eye to be looking at the other thing, so that you can get a side-by-side comparison of them, allowing us to very well match things up with each other. Now, as far as new technology that's being developed for tool mark identification, in court, simply saying that they look the same is no longer enough. It used to be, but it's not anymore. So we now have tool mark databases, which images acquired by forensic comparison microscopes that are built that can provide comparison evidence. And there's also algorithms to statistically analyze tool mark patterns that are being developed, so we can attach a mathematical number for the likelihood that these two are in fact a match. We also now have scanning tools that are being used to measure the depth and height of tool marks. Previously, this is something that couldn't really be done with a ruler because we're talking about microns here, but scanning tools allow us to get incredibly detailed measurements, way better than we can just get with our eyeball and a ruler. Now, when it comes to presenting tool marks in court, the tool mark witness, who is typically going to either be a crime scene investigator or a tool mark expert, depending on who they decide to go with, prepares a written report to present to the jury. Whenever possible, they will actually present the original evidence in court, that tool mark and that tool. Often castings and magnified images in tool mark comparisons are presented in trial. And we can also use such evidence to link a series of crimes together. We're going to talk about this more in ballistics, but if you can prove that the same tool was used at multiple crimes, instead of trying them for each of those crimes separately and having to get a new jury each time, you can try them for all of those crimes together because we've shown that there is a common link. And tool marks are often one of the things that show this common link. All right, so that's what we got about tool marks. Can't wait to practice it with you.